When it comes to dating methods, and we're talking about radioactive dating methods, most people feel stuck in the dark, unqualified to question the clever scientists that promote these methods. But are these methods really trustworthy, and why is it important? Well, it's still about time, and it's time now that we finalize this matter. Although long ages provide no evidence of evolution, the idea of long ages is crucial to keep the vague idea of evolution as vague and unprovable as it is. If there's one thing that will cause people to believe in the long age idea, it is the so-called evidence of radiometric dating. During the 20th century, various different methods were discovered which could be used to calculate the age of certain things. First, we'll talk about carbon dating, and then on the reliability or not of other dating methods. We've already seen how most people in the scientific world believe and accept that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and because this is often repeated through the media and television, which generally support this idea, most of the rest of the world believe it too. In fact, it seems as though the world has a very specific aversion, loathing, detestation, hostility towards the biblical creation of a young earth. Everything possible is done to suppress it and to prevent the teaching thereof, while the idea of evolution and long ages is literally being forced down everyone's throat. Do they have evidence for it? No. How do they know whether it's true? They don't know. They believe that it's true. Can they calculate the long ages? They say they can, but the radiometric dating methods that they use to do so seldom correspond, as you will see. There is a little-known irony in the controversy between creationists and evolutionists about the age of the world. The majority of scientists, the evolutionists, rely on a minority of the relevant data. Yet a minority of scientists, the creationists, use the majority of the relevant data. Adding to the irony is the public's wrong impression that it is the other way around. Therefore many ask, if the evidence is so strongly for a young Earth, why do most scientists believe otherwise? The answer is simple. Most scientists believe the Earth is old because they believe most other scientists believe the Earth is old. Keep in mind, there is no scientific method in existence that can determine the specific age of the Earth and the universe. The idea of millions of years is held by assuming that the rate of change of various processes in the past was exactly the same as it is today, uniformitarianism as explained earlier. So they believe the present is the key to the past. I want to encourage you not to underestimate your ability to understand this information. This is the very reason why evolutionists got away with a false hypothesis for so long. In Dr. Gentry's own words, and referring to the time when he was still a theistic evolutionist, "This I had accomplished by learning to speak a language unknown to the common man. Such had no way to defend themselves because they couldn't speak the language. They didn't know enough to even inquire about the assumptions I was using. Indeed, I hardly understood them myself. Later I would realize this is exactly how evolutionists have gained control of the masses, and this is exactly the way they have managed to undermine and destroy the faith of Christians in the Bible." Now the challenge with this subject is not to give too little, but also not too much information, since that may cause confusion. I will therefore only do an overall discussion, going into depth here and there. But if you are interested in the finer detail, please look at chapter 8 in the book, as well as the list of references at the end of the chapter. So let's begin with carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 is formed when cosmic rays in the upper atmosphere knocks neutrons out of an atom's nucleus. These knocked out neutrons move at a very high speed and collide with ordinary nitrogen, which occurs at a lower level in the atmosphere. When these neutrons knock some of the protons out of the nitrogen, it leads to the formation of carbon-14. Once carbon-14 has formed, it will, just like ordinary carbon, combine with oxygen and change into carbon dioxide, but instead of CO2, it is now 14 CO2. And in this way, carbon-14 circulates through the cells of all plants and animals. Now, a piece of wood was discovered encased in sandstone in Sydney. According to old Earth estimations, it is claimed that the sandstone is up to 230 million years old. However, when they used their carbon-14 dating method on the wood, they discovered that it was only a few thousand years old. So how does that work? Willard Libby and his partners discovered carbon-14 dating early in 1946. It was a great discovery and was seen as a possible method to determine the various ages of early organic materials. Everything that is or that was alive, in other words organic matter, contains carbon in the form of carbon-12, which is not radioactive, and carbon-14, which is radioactive. And this includes people and animals, as well as coal, wood, shells, bones, paper, as well as certain types of fabric. Typically, there are 1 trillion carbon-12 atoms for every single carbon-14 atom, with an estimated 7 kilos of carbon-14 produced in the upper atmosphere every year. Carbon-14 cannot be used to determine the age of rocks, since rocks are not organic. When an organism dies, it no longer absorbs carbon-14, but the carbon-14 within the organism commences with radioactive decay. If you know the rate at which this carbon decay occurs and you know how much carbon is still contained within the organism, then you can determine how long ago it died. Now the AMS technique, that stands for accelerator mass spectrometry, allows for the actual counting of individual carbon-14 atoms, and the sensitivity limit is 1 carbon-14 atom for every 10 to the power of 16 carbon-12 atoms. This is an astonishing sensitivity of 1 part per 10,000 trillion, or the equivalent of detecting 1 unique sand grain along a 100-mile-long seashore. There are various factors which influence the reliability of carbon-14 dating, and we'll look at them shortly. Many people are convinced that carbon-14 dating does prove the existence of millions of years, but this is simply impossible because of the short half-life, only 5,730 years of carbon-14, which causes it to decay very quickly. The half-life is the time it takes for an amount to be halved, and this following table illustrates this quite well. The blue part of the bar graph represents carbon-12, which remains the same because it is not radioactive, and the green part represents carbon-14, which is radioactive and which will decrease as it decays in a stepwise manner. As mentioned, the half-life is 5,730 years. So the second bar shows how exactly half of the original amount of carbon-14 remains after the first half-life period of 5,730 years have lapsed, and we are looking at the green part of the bar. After 2 half-lives, or 11,460 years, there will be another half left. Now a quarter remains, because a half multiplied by a half is a quarter. How did we get to 11,460? We just multiply the half-life by 2. After 3 half-lives, or 17,190 years, yet another half-life will be left. A half times a half times a half is 1/8. The effectiveness of carbon-14 dating, in other words, how effectively carbon-14 can be detected or measured, is limited to only about 6 half-lives, in other words, from 30,000 to 40,000 years, since the amount of carbon-14 left will be so little, 1.56%. After 10 half-lives, or approximately 50,000 to 60,000 years, less than 1,000th will remain. And I agree, 60,000 years sounds like a long time to me as well, but what should really strike you here is this. 60,000 is a lot less than 1,000,000, and significantly less than 65 million years, the extinction date for dinosaurs. If almost all of the carbon-14 disappears after a theoretical age of 50,000 years, we would not expect to find any carbon-14 atoms in 65 million year old dinosaur bones, would we? Now, together with repeated discoveries of red blood cells, soft tissue, and even DNA in dinosaurs, carbon-14 was also recently discovered in their bones and as mentioned in a previous lecture. Once again, this supports their young age. In fact, carbon-14 has been discovered all through the fossil record, and I want to emphasize that it was also discovered in mammoths and coal. What does this mean? It simply means that none of the fossils in the fossil record can be millions of years old. It further means that our children in grade 5 and grade 9 that are taught about coal being 300 and some say 140 million years old are being taught the wrong information, since in addition to the presence of carbon-14 in coal, Dr. Robert Gentry's research and results on the rapid formation and young age of coal has still not been refuted since 1976. These results were published in what is probably one of the world's most prestigious secular journals named Science. We'll look at this shortly. Now, speaking of mammoths, radiocarbon dating has indicated the extinction of the mammoths at less than 4,000 years ago, which is of course the correct age according to the flood events. It follows that mammoths mainly suffered major extinctions after the flood. The question, however, is, did all mammoths really become extinct? The indigenous Evenk tribe of northeastern Siberia has well-preserved mammoth skins in their possession. They described in detail what these animals looked like, how they behaved, what they ate, and even how they hunted these animals themselves. During a Russian expedition in 1922, written records of living mammoths were discovered within this tribe. The discovery of Colonel John Blatchford Snell remains the most exciting. For many years, rumors had been circulating that unusual elephants with features similar to extinct elephants, such as mammoths, occur in western Nepal. The Colonel's discovery of 2 of these elephants confirmed the rumors and sent quite a buzz through the scientific community. The 2 bulls named Rajafaji and Kanji weigh about 7 tons each. Rajafaji is 3.7 meters high, making him the largest Indian elephant on record. Now, these kind of discoveries have until recently simply been ignored by evolutionists, but they are more cautious these days to simply proclaim that mammoths became extinct. Dr. Adrian Lister from the London University said the following: "We are not saying that mammoths definitely died out 4,000 years ago. We're saying that in scientific terms, this is the latest evidence we have got for them. It is always subject to revision." This latest re-evaluation of mammoth history is called the hottest story in paleontology since the coelacanth. Back to carbon-14 dating. The excuse often given by evolutionists when carbon-14 is unexpectedly discovered in old fossils such as T-Rex bones is that the specimens were somehow contaminated, meaning carbon-14 must have contaminated the fossil recently. The RATE team, RATE stands for radioisotopes and the age of the Earth, include the following 7 creation scientists: Stephen Austin and Dr. Andrew Snelling, geologists; Dr. John Baumgardner, geophysicist; Dr. Eugene Chaffin, Dr. De Jong, and Dr. Russell Humphreys, physicists; and Dr. Larry Vardeman, who is a meteorologist and the chairman of RATE. Now, they realized that natural diamonds would be the ultimate test in carbon-14 dating to refute possible contamination as an excuse. Why? Well, diamonds are a crystal type form of pure carbon. The probability of carbon-14 being present in diamonds due to contamination in situ is basically 0, because it is the hardest material on Earth with a highly impenetrable mineral structure. It only melts at 4,000 degrees Celsius. Now, the general view is that diamonds were formed between 1 and 3 billion years ago at a depth of about 100 to 200 kilometers under Earth's surface under extremely high pressure and temperature. At a later stage, these diamonds were transported to the surface in extremely violent eruptions through volcanic pipes. Some diamonds are found in these pipes called kimberlites, which is a volcanic diamond-bearing rock. Interestingly, fresh unpetrified wood has recently been discovered 300 meters deep inside kimberlite in Canada, providing strong evidence that the wood and the kimberlite is definitely not millions of years old. These ages were of course determined by radioisotope dating. If diamonds really were 1 to 3 billion years old, we would not expect to find even a single carbon-14 atom within. Now, Wright's carbon-14 experiments on diamonds are the first ever in scientific literature. Do you think they were able to locate any carbon-14 in this old crystal? Indeed. The results clearly indicated that carbon-14 was present at 10 times over the detection limit. The detection limit is the lowest amount that is distinguishable from the absence thereof. Dr. Baumgartner repeated this experiment with a total of 12 diamonds from different countries, and the results were consistently similar. The fact that carbon-14, with its characteristic short half-life, is still present in diamonds provides seriously compelling and sparkling evidence against the proposed long ages. It loudly supports a young supernatural creation because carbon-14 should not be there if planet Earth really was billions of years old, since it falls below the detection limit within 100,000 years. Those long ages are now science fiction. Evolutionists have proposed that the diamonds were contaminated by modern carbon during the testing process. Yet, modern laboratories are equipped with sophisticated procedures to prevent this. And the fact that consistent results were achieved with a total of 12 diamonds from different localities, Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, and Guinea, makes it impossible to attribute the presence of carbon-14 in diamonds to a one-time experimental error. Even the claim that carbon-14 was produced by neutron capture by nitrogen-14 impurities is invalid, since this would have produced less than 1/10,000th of the measured amount. Now, by replicating the exact natural processes of temperature and pressure, diamonds can be made artificially from carbon in a very short amount of time. In fact, a certain company actually manufactures diamonds by extracting carbon from the cremated remains of a deceased family member as a tribute. The carbon is purified and converted to graphite by baking at temperatures of 3000 degrees Celsius. The gem is then created within only a few months by placing the graphite in a unique diamond press that replicates the forces of nature. Remarkably, these diamonds are molecularly identical to modern diamonds or natural diamonds. It follows that natural diamonds obviously don't need billions of years to form. Today we know that diamonds can be produced even faster, within days, hours, even minutes. Read all about this in the article by Fangrad. I mentioned earlier that there are various factors affecting the carbon-14 dating method. Keep the following formula in mind when we discuss these challenges. The more carbon-14 measured within an organism, the younger it is, and the less that is measured in an organism, the older it is. Now, plants discriminate or choose against carbon that contains carbon-14. This means that plants take up less carbon-14 than we would expect, and therefore, when tested, appear older than they really are. The ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in the atmosphere was not always constant. It wasn't always the same. It was affected by the industrial age, during which the burning of massive amounts of fossil fuels caused the amount of carbon-12 to increase in relation to carbon-14. Organisms that died at that time would also appear older than they really are when dated. The atmospheric testing of atomic bombs during the 1950s led to an increase in the amount of carbon-14. The ages of organisms obtained by carbon dating since this time would cause them to appear younger than they actually are. The Genesis flood would have had a major impact on the carbon balance when massive amounts of carbon in the form of plants and animals were buried, later changing into coal and oil. During the pre-flood centuries, the carbon-14 component was distributed uniformly throughout the Earth's vegetation. The burial of massive amounts of biomass, plants and animals during the flood led to the fairly uniform traces of carbon-14 which are found throughout the Earth's strata today, no matter what rock is tested. The entire Phanerozoic eon, which is those layers that include visible life, are considered by many creationists to be flood-deposited rock. The carbon-14 content of coal and many other earth materials varies between 0.1 and 0.5% modern carbon, translated into carbon-14 ages of between 44,000 and 57,000 years based on several assumptions. Now, even though these ages are dramatically younger than the normally accepted ages of typically hundreds of millions of years, the RAID team concluded that a key assumption used in obtaining these younger ages, are not correct. So let me explain. The amount of carbon-14 produced is affected by the amount of cosmic rays penetrating Earth through the atmosphere, which is again affected by the activity of the Sun and the strength of Earth's magnetic field. The stronger the magnetic field, the more cosmic rays are deflected away and the less carbon-14 is produced. Now, the energy of Earth's magnetic field has decreased significantly. The stronger magnetic field that existed before the flood would have deflected cosmic rays away from the Earth more efficiently than today and would therefore cause less carbon-14 to produce. In other words, the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio was much lower before the flood than today. This is known because of the great reservoir of fossil fuels which were buried during the flood. In fact, the total amount of carbon found within carbonate rocks and fossil fuels is at least 100 times greater than which is found in the total biosphere of living plants and animals today. This huge biomass would have diluted the carbon-14 in the pre-flood world at least 100 times. Since at least 100 times more carbon-12 was present to that today, and this would give a low ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 compared to the present world. Because less carbon-14 was produced before the flood, it would cause older organisms to seem even older than they really are. In fact, the total amount of carbon-14 in a given organism at the time of the flood was likely at least 100 times less than is the case today. Therefore, when considering all these factors, the calculated carbon-14 dates in, for example, coal and diamonds of 44,000 to 57,000 years can easily decrease tenfold to 5,000 years, consistent with flood history. This young age is also confirmed by the amount of helium still present in Earth's Precambrian rocks, which we'll also look at shortly. Today we have a much higher rate of carbon-14 to carbon-12 than before and at the beginning of the flood. This will cause organisms buried during the flood and dated by carbon-14 dating to appear older than they really are. All these factors must be considered and corrected for. Carbon-14 has found many applications which are of interest to biblical studies. A well-known example is the Dead Sea Scrolls, viewed as one of the most famous archaeological discoveries of all time. These documents were discovered by a Bedouin shepherd boy in 1947 in several caves near the Dead Sea, amounting to 800 manuscripts written in Hebrew and Aramaic. The preserved Old Testament manuscripts were found to be very similar to our modern text of the Bible, and as a result, some scholars initially concluded that the scrolls are fairly recent in age, perhaps dating from AD 500. However, carbon-14 dating of the linen wrappings, which is a plant material, showed that the scrolls were much older, dating between 150 BC and AD 70. This is more than 1,000 years older than other known Hebrew biblical texts. And this is a wonderful demonstration of God's providence in preserving the accuracy of His word throughout human history. If carbon dating is carefully applied to early organisms or items, it can be very useful. But even when such historic calibrations or corrections are taken into account, some archaeologists view carbon-14 dates as inaccurate. However, the presence of carbon-14 continues to provide indisputable conclusive proof against millions of years. Now, which carbon-14 date is fed to the public? Professor Brew presented the general attitude of archaeologists regarding carbon-14 dating during a symposium in 1970 on the prehistory of the Nile Valley. If a carbon-14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, we put it in a footnote. And if it is completely out of date, we just drop it. Let's investigate radioisotope dating in more detail. Today, several radiometric or radioisotope dating methods are used to indicate millions and even billions of years for rocks. Unlike with carbon-14 dating, the relative concentrations are measured when a parent product decays radioactively into its various daughter products or isotopes. The radioactive decay happens in specific steps whereby different concentrations of isotopes are formed that can be accurately measured. These techniques are now applied to rocks, especially igneous rocks such as volcanic rocks, and it is normally presumed to indicate the age when the rock crystallized or hardened. However, concentrations are not ages and rocks are not clocks. To infer ages from such concentrations first of all requires the proposal and acceptance of a whole bunch of unverifiable assumptions. To illustrate this, let's look at an hourglass as an analogy. Let's say the hourglass represents a rock specimen of unknown age. The sand in the top section represents the radioactive parent isotope, which have not yet decayed. As the material disintegrates or decays, the resulting daughter atoms are shown by the sand accumulating in the bottom. The parent isotope's half-life is represented by the narrowness of the neck of the glass. The smaller the opening, the less the trickle of sand will be, and vice versa. Now we get to the assumptions. It is assumed that the conditions at the beginning are known. How do we know whether daughter isotopes weren't already present at the beginning? In other words, in the bottom of the hourglass. How do we know in which quantities and ratios these isotopes were present? Secondly, it is assumed that the system is closed. In other words, no parent or daughter isotopes could have been added or gone missing. And thirdly, it is assumed that the rate of decay has always been the same. How do we know if it was not higher sometime in the past? Now, with regards to radiometric dating methods or clocks, these three assumptions are unprovable and invalid, rendering these clocks as useless. Back to the context of the hourglass analogy. The grains of the sand fall at a steady or constant rate from the top to the bottom of the glass bowl. At time 0, the hourglass is turned upside down, and by time 1 or 1 hour later, all the sand is supposed to have fallen into the bottom of the glass bowl. Now, this hourglass type of clock works because the initial conditions are known. In other words, all the sand grains are in the top of the glass bowl and none are in the bottom at time 0. If there is already some sand in the bottom glass bowl and the amount is not known, then the hourglass clock cannot tell the time. With regards to radiometric dating, no scientist can ever know the initial conditions because no scientist was present at Earth's formation. Similarly, if the system has not remained closed, for example, if sand were somehow added or subtracted, then the calculation of the elapsed time based on comparing the amounts of sand in the two glass bowls will again lead to an incorrect conclusion. There is no way to prove that radioactive systems remained closed throughout all the supposed millions of years of radioactive decay. Again, because no scientist was present. Interestingly, the evidence indicates the opposite. that rocks are not closed systems, but that they are open to various environmental influences. And because it is open to the environment, it can potentially exchange atoms with its surroundings. In other words, parent and daughter atoms may enter or exit a rock at any given time in history. Furthermore, it is known that uranium is generally a mobile element in the natural environment, particularly in groundwater near the Earth's surface. Some of the uranium may leach out, or some may have been deposited into the rock sample by groundwater. Geochronologists often plot the chemical analysis of the isotopes expressed as isotope ratios on graphs, and these often show that the parent-daughter systems have not been closed, but open. Finally, if the rate at which the sand grains fell from the upper part of the glass to the lower part changed, for example, moisture caused some clogging of the sand in the constriction between the two glass sections, then again the hourglass clock will be inaccurate. The assumption of a constant decay rate, that this rate has always been the same, can in no way be proven, since no one was there to measure it. Even with the special pleading done by geochronologists and physicists by saying that radioactive decay rates have been carefully measured in laboratories for the last 80 to 90 years, 80 to 90 years are being extrapolated backwards in time to the origin of the Earth, believed to be 4.6 billion years ago. That is an enormous extrapolation. If this kind of elaborate extrapolation of results over many orders of magnitude was done in any other field of scientific research, thereby assuming continuity of results over such enormous spans of unobserved time, they would be literally laughed out of the courts by their fellow scientists and mathematicians. Yet this has been allowed uncontested, primarily because it makes these radioactive clocks work. It should be clear that none of these assumptions, which are foundational to the radioactive dating techniques, can be proven, and therefore it is invalid. Let's look at some examples. How did granite fall? This question is one that is still greatly discussed and debated. There are various theories. One of the persistent scientific objections to the Earth being young, in other words 6 to 7,000 years instead of 4.6 billion years, has been the so-called evidence, according to radiometric dating, that the large bodies of granite rocks found at the Earth's surface today took millions of years to cool and solidify from magma. However, contradictory evidence in this regard has begun to surface, which points to a relatively rapid, even catastrophic formation of granites. The radiometric dating of rocks involves the radioactive decay of some parent element via various daughter elements or isotopes to its stable, non-radioactive end product. Isotopes are different forms of the same element. As an example, we can look at uranium-238 as the parent element, which radioactively decays via various daughter elements to lead-206, the non-radioactive, stable end product. By measuring how much of the parent element in a rock has decayed into its end product, and the current rate of this decay, most geologists believe that they can determine when the parent element was incorporated into the rock during crystallization, and thus the age of the rock. The question we should ask here, however, is whether the current rate of radioactive decay of all the elements have always been the same. If it remained constant, it would mean that the amount of uranium in a rock would constantly diminish, while the end product lead would constantly increase over millions of years. In this instance, the ratio of uranium to lead would be a measure of time since the rock solidified. However, if the rate of decay was much faster, sometime in the past, the lead would have rapidly accumulated in the rock. More precisely, that which would normally have taken millions of years would have been accomplished in a very short time. Let's investigate this by climbing right into granites. Granite consists of various different mineral particles, Some particles look like dull pieces of glass. This is called quartz. Other particles are light gray or pink. It's called feldspar. And other particles are black. This is called biotite or black mica. We are particularly interested in black mica, and if we zoom in a little bit more, we discover tiny mineral crystals called zircons. Zircon crystals look a lot like those little zirconia earrings, but these were formed through a chemical process in the laboratory. Zircon also occurs naturally, and it's normally smaller than a grain of sand. Not only is it found in granite, but also in sea sand and in moon rocks. The Bible refers to the larger zircon crystals as hyacinths. Okay, so we have now climbed into granites, into mica, and into the zircon crystal. The radioactive uranium element, uranium-238, is present in the zircon, which means that the tiny zircon crystal as a whole becomes a radio center, as represented by the little black dot in the center of these figures. So the uranium is found within the zircon crystal, within the mica, within granite, and because it is radioactive, radiation takes place, which simply means that the original amount itself becomes smaller in quantity each time. And if conditions are favorable, and this decay occurs within a solid crystalline structure, a radioactive signature in the form of a concentric radiosphere is formed around the radio center. The various spheres of crystal damage is very similar to the different layers of an onion. These spheres are correctly termed halos, and they were first discovered in 1898 by Mary Curry and her husband. Now, uranium and its radioactive daughter elements decay in one of two ways. Firstly, by ejecting a very light fragment, the beta particle, which causes little damage as it passes through matter, therefore leaving no visible damage trail or scar. This is the green sections in the table. And secondly, by ejecting a much heavier nuclear fragment, the alpha particle, which leaves a visible and permanent damage scar in the form of a sphere or halo. And this is the brown sections in the table. Now, the radioactive decay chain from uranium to lead includes 15 isotopes or 15 daughter elements, of which 8 emit alpha particles in all directions. This is represented, as I said, by the brown colored parts in the table. As mentioned, these alpha particles are shot out in all directions to a maximum distance as determined by the energy level of the specific elements that is present in the radio center. This is known as the MeV, or the milli-electron volt level. In general, the greater the decay energy, the larger the halo. Most damage occurs near the end of the damage trail, where the alpha particle stops, which is why a darker ring or halo is visible at a specific distance from the radioactive center. By accurately measuring the distance from the radio center to the sphere, it can be determined which isotope was present within the radio center. In other words, we can determine which isotope is responsible for the formation of a specific halo. To summarize, a halo is a three-dimensional circle that forms because of the alpha particle decay, which damages and discolors the surrounding material. A large number of alpha particles are required to form a visible radio halo, typically in the order of 500 million, which amounts to about 100 million years of decay for an isotope such as uranium-238. Remember, the radio halos can only form within a solid crystalline structure such as a rock, for example. The halos are a record of damage to the alignment of the atoms. If radio halos are observed in an igneous rock formation, they must have formed after the rock had crystallized, cooled, and solidified. If the rock is reheated at a later time to more than 150 degrees Celsius, the radio halos will fade and disappear as the crystal atoms realign themselves and repair the crystal damage. Now, the last three circles or halos in the alpha emitting decay chain of uranium to lead is formed by polonium. Uranium-238 is therefore the source of polonium, which is continually formed within rocks due to the radioactive alpha decay of uranium-238. The polonium atoms are also radioactive and therefore also emit radioactive particles, just like uranium. Although the uranium isotope has a very long half-life of 4.5 billion years, all of the polonium isotopes have short half-lives, ranging from 138 days for polonium-210 to only 164 microseconds for polonium-214. In this figure, polonium-210 formed one sphere, the second figure, polonium-214, formed a second sphere, and the third figure shows polonium-218, which formed a third sphere. And this is what a cross-section of the halos look like under a microscope. Credit to Dr. Robert Gentry. Now, the discovery made by Dr. Gentry, however, revealed the existence of enormous amounts of polonium-218 halos completely on their own, orphaned and independent of uranium within rocks. So instead of discovering the figure on the top right, he discovered enormous numbers of the figure on the left. So they don't form part of the original 8 spheres of the parent element, as explained to you and as indicated on the smaller figure. Now, the half-life of polonium-218 is only 3.5 minutes. In other words, within 3.5 minutes, the sphere begins to form. Their short half-life demands that the alpha particles must immediately cause the coloration in the mineral to almost instantaneously form primordial halos, and this can only form within a solid crystalline structure. After each successive half-life, the halo will become more prominent. It will become darker, and after about 10 half-lives or 10 radiations, the halo will show very little change because the source of polonium-218 will by then be depleted. Remember, I mentioned earlier that if radiohalos are observed in igneous rock formations, they must have formed after the rock had cooled and solidified. If the granite slow cooled over millions of years, there would be no polonium halos in the granites today, since they have such a fleeting existence and would have disappeared a long time ago, before the granites could have hardened into a crystalline structure wherein the halos would be visible. Now let's illustrate all of this in a simplified way, with full credit to Dave Gentry, by using a glass of water and an effervescent tablet. The tablet represents an amount of polonium, and the glass of water represents molten granite. When you place the effervescent tablet into the water, it starts to produce bubbles. These bubbles represent the radiation being radiated by the polonium in the granite. The bubbles will of course disappear after about 30 seconds, and nothing will remain except water with a slightly milky or dull color. Is there any way in which we can preserve these bubbles as they are? We can put the glass of water and bubbles into the freezer. Of course, the water will freeze after a while. This is similar to the evolutionary proposition that molten rock or magma slow cooled and solidified to form granite. But as you've probably already guessed, by simply freezing this glass of water containing the effervescent bubbles will be of no help at all, since the bubbles would have disappeared long before the water could freeze. And that is exactly what would have happened with polonium radiation. If the granite slow cooled over millions of years, it would have disappeared a long time before any polonium halos could have been imprinted into the solid rock. If, however, we take a photo of this glass containing the bubbles, you will know that something must have happened to make this water freeze so rapidly, and in this instance it was just frozen by taking a photo. In the same way, when we are looking at a radio halo which we know was formed from a specific type of polonium, we then know that the granite surrounding it was formed very rapidly, possibly instantly. Moreover, this means that all the evolutionary ideas around the formation of the Earth over millions of years is wrong. The mystery is how these short-lived, parentless or orphaned halos originated or became embedded in crystalline rock without uranium atoms existing in the same or immediate location. We will investigate the interpretation of two creationist parties. Firstly, we will look at that of Dr. Gentry, and secondly, that of the Wraith scientists. One possible interpretation is that the polonium atoms were instantly placed within granite at the moment of creation, at which time they quickly decayed and formed permanent halos. Dr. Gentry states that the short half-life of polonium-218 demands that the alpha particles must immediately cause the coloration in the mineral to almost instantaneously form primordial halos in a solid crystalline structure. If the polonium centers were not instantaneously created in the mineral, the alpha particles would fly off into empty space. In this case, the halos would provide evidence of an instant supernatural creation of Earth's original rock formations. Dr. Gentry asked the question, did the short half-life of polonium-218 of 3.5 minutes provide a mute witness to the measure of time that elapsed from the creation of the chemical elements to the time that the granites formed as igneous rocks? In his search for the truth, Dr. Gentry discovered what he believes to be God's fingerprints of creation in Earth's Precambrian granite rocks. An almost instantaneous creation of Earth's granites collapses several so-called billion years of Earth's history into almost nothing. It was clear that there were trillions of polonium halos scattered throughout the Precambrian granites all around the world. The Precambrian forms the lowermost layers of the geologic column. If the polonium-218 radiohalos with their characteristically short half-life can only form within a solid crystalline structure, such as rocks, and if they can occur independently of uranium, and if the half-life of polonium-218 about the time in which the radio halo was formed is only a few minutes, then this polonium must have been created within the original Precambrian granites. Remember, granite is the framework of planet Earth. But there is substantial resistance within the scientific community towards Dr. Gentry's point of view. The Rate scientists' research on radiohalos brought them to a different conclusion regarding the origin of the orphaned polonium-218 occurring in granite. It's important to understand that even within creation science, scientists sometimes differ on certain issues. By being honest about these differences, one can eventually reach the best scientific conclusion. According to the Rate scientists, the large number of orphaned or parentless polonium-218 halos is derived from the radioactive decay of uranium. Hereby, polonium-218 has a secondary formation and not primary by the hand of God, as suggested by Gentry. If radiohalos are observed in an igneous rock formation, they must have formed after the rock cooled and solidified. This means that the radioactive decay of uranium had to commence relatively fast, at an increased rate of decay as soon as the granite started to solidify, and continue to do so until the polonium radiohalos were formed. Rate agrees that the polonium radiohalos were formed very rapidly, however, not only during creation week, also during the flood. Rate proposed that the polonium atoms were removed and carried away from the uranium source shortly after their formation by hydrothermal fluid to form secondary polonium halos in other localities close to the uranium source. They have found that many of the polonium halos had uranium halos right next to them, often less than 1 millimeter away. If the uranium decayed and produced the halo rings, it also generated polonium. Hot water flowing inside the cooling granite was able to carry the polonium short distances and concentrate it into new radio centers, and these formed the polonium halos. They propose that this process, the accumulation and decay, could have taken anything from 6 to 10 days, no longer. The circulating fluid would serve to carry and dissipate the heat away from the magma body. Now, the presence of the short-lived polonium halos indicate that the magma cooled very rapidly to solid rock rather than over long periods. According to the rate team, the presence of such large amounts of these polonium halos and other daughter products in Earth's rocks indicates the possibility of 2 periods of highly accelerated nuclear decay, with about 90% of the total occurring during the early part of creation week and the remainder during the year of the Genesis flood. There is a narrow window of time when the temperature falls beneath the annealing temperature, remember that is 150 degrees Celsius, until the rocks cool so much that the fluids can no longer penetrate the biotite crystal structure. The polonium halos could only have formed if there was an abundant supply of polonium, an equivalent to the amount of 100 million years of radioactive decay of uranium at today's rates. All this polonium had to be available quickly, before it could decay away. Therefore, it had to concentrate within hours or a few days, 6 to 10 at most, because remember, a large amount of alpha particles are required to form a visible halo. This means that 100 million years of radioactive decay of uranium at present rates occurred in just a few days. Stated differently, the radioactive decay of uranium was formerly up to 1 billion times faster than today. If uranium decayed at such a super fast rate, this means that the other radioactive elements decayed much faster too. However, the radioactive methods used to date rocks at billions of years old incorrectly assume that radioactive decay rates have always been the same as measured today. But the presence of polonium halos provides solid evidence that rocks dated as billions of years old by the radioactive methods are in fact only a few thousand years old, just as predicted by Dr. Gentry years ago. Dr. de Jong, one of the rate scientists, explains that accelerated decay is a tentative model for explaining the vast amounts of nuclear products in igneous rocks that intruded into flood-deposited strata. However, it is simply not known whether all radioactive nuclei decayed equally or proportionally to their mass. The rate research project showed some evidence that the shorter the original half-life, the less accelerated decay occurred. If true, polonium-210, with a half-life of 138 days, may have experienced no accelerated decay at all. Taz Walker states how the amount of acceleration depends on the half-life. Isotopes with a longer half-life, such as uranium-238, experience more acceleration than isotopes with a short half-life, such as polonium. And this is confirmed by Dr. de Jong. To summarize regarding these two parties, both creation science parties agree that granite was formed very rapidly, and the evidence provided by both parties supplied devastating evidence against a billions-of-year-old Earth. Uranium and polonium radio halos thus provide startling evidence of catastrophic geological processes on a young Earth. Some of the main points of discourse between Dr. Gentry and Rate summarized in the back of my book, and you're welcome to have a look at that. Now, the Rate scientists began their research in 1997 with the objective of clarifying the history of the Earth. Their research is of an extremely high standard and spanned over 80 years. It involved much more than simply proving evolution wrong. Existing data was reanalyzed, whereby all the guesswork regarding the age of the Earth and the preconceived evolutionary ideas were removed and replaced with the correct biblical data. Their research was focused on the critical investigation of all the radioisotope dating methods. Keep in mind that this is the primary methods used to try and prove an old Earth. From their work, it becomes crystal clear that the fossil record was formed during the flood, only a few thousand years ago. The evidence also confirms that macroevolution, as an explanation for the origin of living organisms, can no longer be defended in a coherent and rational manner. In other words, when you use your common sense without allowing your preconceived ideas or emotions to affect you, then evolution makes no scientific sense. Let's have a look at what else they discovered in granite. By now it should be quite clear how uranium-238 decays to lead-206 in a very specific and orderly manner, whereby 8 sets of alpha particles are emitted to form 8 halos around the radioactive center. The radioactive center containing uranium-238 is located within zircon crystals, within mica, within granite. During the radioactive decay, some alpha particles remain behind in the zircon crystals. Those particles now combine with the electrons close by to form helium, which is a gas. This is the very same gas that makes you speak funny when you inhale it from a helium balloon. The helium atoms are chemically very slippery, meaning they do not combine with other atoms to form molecules. Helium atoms are very small and are constantly restless on the move. Remember, helium is a gas, which means it cannot be easily trapped, and because helium is such a small atom with only 2 protons, it escapes very easily, which is why your helium balloon deflates so quickly. Now, according to the standard evolutionary geology, the New Mexico borehole is seen as very old, dated at 1.5 billion years, according to the method called lead-lead. This rock is classified as Precambrian. The helium gas within rocks this old should have completely disappeared a long time ago, as the helium gas constantly escapes or diffuses upwards and outwards to the surface and eventually to the atmosphere. But to everyone's utter amazement, there were still large amounts of helium trapped within the zircon crystals of this old rock. The rate scientists continued to test their hypothesis, which is the large amount of helium still contained within zircons were there due to a period of accelerated radioactive decay only a few thousand years ago. Because this helium was formed relatively recently, large amounts still appear in rocks. The rate of diffusion whereby helium escapes is known today. For the long ages explanation of these large amounts of helium to be true would require a rate 100,000 times slower than what we currently know it occurs at. Statistical analysis of helium in zircon crystals placed the age of these zircons between 6,000 and 2,000 years old. That is about 250,000 times younger than the proposed old age of 1.5 billion years for these crystals in the rocks, and agrees 100% with biblical history. The right scientists discovered that this high concentration of helium could not be maintained for more than a few thousand years at the current rate of diffusion before it would disappear. In Earth's recent history, one or more periods of accelerated radioactive decay occurred, probably during creation and also during the Genesis flood. This led to the formation of the large amounts of helium that can still be observed today. Their research loudly and proudly serves as confirmation of a relatively young Earth. Dr. Russell Humphrey's research on helium in zircons has supplied an estimated age of the Earth at around 5,680 years, plus minus 2,000 years both ways. Now let's look at coal. Wood is converted into coal if the right conditions of water, temperature and pressure exists for a sufficient time period. Coal is an abundant fossil fuel consisting of vegetation buried in sediment and is almost entirely composed of carbon. The vegetation had obviously been ripped up by the flood, and it would have been sorted by the water in different components such as leaves and twigs and bark, branches and trunks, and deposited in different places. The vegetation, which is deposited in layers, the coal seams, is usually interspersed with other layers of sediment and volcanic ash. Due to the effects of heat, water and pressure, chemical reactions would take place in the vegetation. Fluids such as sap and water would have been driven off, forming gas and oil, and move out of the source rock. The remaining vegetation material would turn black and become coal. The question remains, how long does this take? Such changes can occur quite rapidly, within months, even weeks. These reactions would have continued in the 4,500-year period after the flood. According to Dr. Taz Walker, even today, when oil reservoirs are emptied, the oil can be replenished in periods of years and decades because the chemical reactions are still taking place. Carbon-14 has so far never been absent from coal, and because it is present, it indicates a young age for coal. Let's look at other confirmation of this young age. Dr. Gentry also investigated the presence of radio halos in logs. This is wood that partially turned into coal. These particular logs were recovered from uranium mines on the Colorado Plateau, western USA, which are located in uranium-rich sedimentary strata of 3 separate geological formations, the Jurassic, Triassic, and Eocene. Radiometric ages ranging from 35 to 250 million years have previously been assigned to some of these formations, while the general view is that coal took 300 million years to form. His research shows how all 3 geological formations, the Jurassic, Triassic, and Eocene, ranging from 35 to 250 million years, according to long ages, are the same age. And secondly, that the presence of radio halos in coal indicates that the coal is only a few thousand years old. His results were published in the 1976 edition of the prestigious Science Journal, and to this day stands uncontested. When looking at this table again, we can see that polonium-210 is the last radioactive isotope in the alpha decay from uranium-238 to lead-206. In his book, Creation's Tiny Mystery, Dr. Gentry explains how the formation of secondary polonium halos required geological specimens with 3 basic components: an abundance of uranium, in other words, a uranium-rich solution contains all the isotopes in the table to supply the secondary polonium atoms. Secondly, a type of matrix which would facilitate the rapid and free movement of secondary polonium atoms, otherwise the short half-lives of these atoms would have caused them to decay before they could be captured. And thirdly, microscopic sized capture sites where sufficient amounts of polonium atoms could accumulate and concentrate in order for visible halos to form. The coal wood specimens or logs from the uranium-rich mines provided evidence which suggested that the wood had been in a water-soaked, gel-like condition at some earlier period in Earth's history. At the time, a uranium-rich solution had passed through the wood, permitting the accumulation of uranium at certain capture sites with an affinity for uranium. Secondary uranium halos then formed around the capture sites. Dr. Gentry also investigated the existence of other microscopic sites which might possibly have captured polonium. Secondary polonium halos were discovered and were present in greater quantities than secondary uranium halos. An interesting fact is that most of the radio halos consisted of only one type, those that were formed from the accumulation and decay of polonium-210, which forms only one halo. Neither of the other 2 polonium halo types, polonium-218 or polonium-214, that occur in granites were seen. The fact that only one halo was repeatedly formed suggests that the radioactive center only contained polonium-210 at some stage. Now, the presence of polonium and other daughter isotopes in the solution indicate a period of significantly accelerated radioactive decay rates sometime in the past. Certain capture sites in the wood attracted polonium atoms, and because the polonium-210 atoms lived long enough with a half-life of 138 days, it was captured from the infiltrating uranium-rich solution and concentrated at the capture sites before commencing with radioactive decay. In contrast, the other two radioactive polonium isotopes, polonium-214 and polonium-218, with half-lives of 164 milliseconds and 3.5 minutes respectively, decayed away within minutes before they could accumulate to form visible halos. A very interesting aspect of these halos in the coal stumps is that the shape is elliptic rather than circular, and the coal stumps are derived from three different geological formations, the Triassic, Jurassic, and Eocene. This provides extremely strong evidence that the wood in all three layers were in the same gel-like condition when it was infiltrated by the uranium-rich solution, and it fits 100% with the flood events. After uranium-rich solutions, which contain the various isotopes in the table, infiltrated the water-drenched wood, the radio centers would have accumulated polonium-210 atoms from the solution. Secondary polonium-210 halos would have developed in less than 1 year. The halos, of course, were round at first, but as the pressure from the overlying flood sediments increased, the jelly-like wood was easily compressed, which led to the formation of these elliptic or oval-shaped halos as indicated in the photo. Another critically important question is this: how much time had lapsed since the formation of the circular halos to the time of their compression into an elliptical shape? Now, this question would have remained unanswered had it not been for the discovery of dual polonium halos, elliptical and round together, in the Triassic and Jurassic specimens, and as shown in the photo. The halo radio centers also captured another uranium daughter product, namely lead-210. Now, since this isotope of lead decays with a half-life of about 22 years to polonium, a second polonium halo would develop within approximately 20 years after the first one had formed. If no deformation due to compression of the wood had occurred, then both halos would have remained circular and also overlapped. If a compression event occurred after 20 years, both halos would have been compressed into an elliptical shape while still overlapping. However, if the compression of the wood occurred within only a few years after the introduction of the uranium-rich solution, then only one polonium-210 halo would have been compressed, since only one had then been formed. Several years later, another circular halo developed, as lead decayed to polonium-210, and superimpose on this elliptical halo. Since no further compression of the wood occurred, these two halos retain their respective shapes and appear as a dual halo. From this sequence of events, we can conclude the following. A single uranium solution simultaneously infiltrated all the wood specimens. Since the elliptical polonium halos indicate that the wood specimens from the Jurassic, Triassic and Eocene formations were all in the same gel-like condition at the time of the infiltration, it obviously follows that all three formations were deposited at about the same time. The presence of dual polonium halos in the wood specimens from the Jurassic and Triassic formations provides strong evidence that the compression event occurred simultaneously in both formations. Because of the 138-day half-life of polonium-210, less than 4 years went by from when the solution initially infiltrated the wood until the wood was compressed. This compression took place during the deposition and deformation of sedimentary rocks in the years after the floodwaters receded. The compression and formation of elliptic radiohalos must therefore have happened before the wood turned to coal, simply because fully formed coal would have crumbled under the pressure. The radiohalos are therefore older than the coal. The importance of these findings cannot be underestimated, since it indicates that all three formations, the Jurassic, Triassic, and Eocene, are the same age. If the old Earth scenario were true, it would mean that the Triassic, the oldest formation, already turned to coal before the Eocene layer was deposited. The compression of the halos would not have been possible if that were true. As already mentioned, his results were published in the Science Journal in 1976 with absolutely no objections or oppositions to this very day. A symposium was organized by Raphael Kazman at the Louisiana State University in 1978. The conclusions drawn there were that the current geological timescales were about 10,000 times too large. Stated differently, the estimated age of the Earth is at least 10,000 times too high. The period necessary for the formation of coal depends on the combination of pressure, water, and temperature. Under optimal conditions, coal can be formed in less than 1 year. At the Argonne National Laboratory in the USA, it was demonstrated how black coal of a very high quality was formed within only 4 to 36 weeks. Although isotope concentrations can be accurately measured, these isotopes, or the ratios between them, are not dates. There is more than enough evidence to prove that radioisotope dating methods are not as flawless and foolproof as generally assumed, and they certainly do not determine millions of years. In cases where the age of a rock was known, for example, where the lava from a volcano began to solidify, and certain radiometric dating methods were applied, all the dates differed. We're talking about millions of years of difference. Dr. Andrew Snelling, who is also one of the rate scientists, started a project in which the dates of various eyewitness accounts regarding the solidification of lava was compared to the dates obtained by the application of potassium-argon dating method. Mount Ngauruhoe is New Zealand's newest volcano and one of the most active. It is thought to have been active for at least 2,500 years, with more than 70 eruptive periods since 1839. Samples from the last lava flows from 1949, 1954, and 1975 were taken for analysis and dating by the potassium-argon dating method. The samples and results were analyzed at one of the world's most respected laboratories named Yukon Laboratories in Massachusetts. The eyewitnesses all agreed that the rocks were aged between 25 and 51 years. Radiometric dating of the 11 samples, however, indicated ages that spanned from 270,000 years, 290,000, 800,000, 1 million, 1.2 million, 1.3 million, 1.5 million, and 3.5 million years. A rather huge difference, I would say, from 50 years. So which date is fed to the public? If the long-age supporters obtain a date that corresponds with what they think it should be, then that date is published. All the other wrong or unacceptable dates are simply ignored as clearly stated in the previous quotation. If a carbon-14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, we put it in a footnote. And if it is completely out of date, we just drop it. Why? Because it doesn't fit into their preconceived idea of long ages, and because it confuses their whole theory. Furthermore, they have absolutely no problem in making up yet another story to explain away the results. The well-known geologist Dr. John Wood-Murapi has listed hundreds of examples of these explanations of bad dates. In his devastating critique of radioactive dates, his eventual conclusion was that radioactive dating was yet another example of storytelling to fit into the preconceived idea of the researchers. It simply doesn't make sense. If the dating methods are reliable, then they should at least roughly produce the same results. Yet they differ by millions of years. Finally, I would like to conclude with these two tables, which are also in the book. In the first table, some examples are listed of cases where radiometric dating on samples with known ages gave ages far older than the true age. The true age of the Hualalai basalts in Hawaii at the time when potassium-argon dating was conducted was 169 years. However, the calculated radiometric age came to 1.6 million years, that is 9,470 times too high. The Mount St. Helens eruption was dated at 10 years. However, radiometric dating provided an age of between 0.34 and 2.8 million years, that is between 28,000 and 233,000 times too high. If these radioisotope dating methods do not properly date rocks of known ages, how can we trust them to date rocks of unknown ages? Trusting these methods to give factual dates would then become a matter of faith, not science. In the second table, it is indicated how radiometric dating methods differ from the proposed, the estimated long ages. When looking at the fourth column, it should be crystal clear that radiometric dating is definitely not as accurate and foolproof as secular scientists would like you to believe. The estimated date for the Grand Canyon Plateau basalt is 1 million years. However, the calculated radiometric age was 1.34 billion years. That is 1,340 times too high than their estimated age. Furthermore, the basalt above should be younger than the basalt in the canyon, but according to the dating method, it is 270 million years older than the basalt in the canyon. Mammoths are estimated to be 70 million years old, yet carbon-14 dating gave an age of less than 4,000 years, that is 17,500 times younger than their estimated evolutionary age. One fact we do know about these dating methods is that the differences are consistently consistent. Ultimately, it is all about time. Nothing has been so effective in robbing people of their faith in Christ, as well as the truth of the Bible, as the so-called scientific evidence that the earth is very old. This evidence is based on radiometric dating methods. With an injection of a guesstimated 15 billion years, the age of the universe, the greatest miracle, testifying to the omnipotence and majesty of God, our Creator, is reduced to a natural phenomenon where God is not even required. Without these so-called long ages, the idea of evolution is just not possible. Some critics have argued that the young earth viewpoint is a hindrance in scientific progress, claiming that the belief in biblical creation returns us back to the dark ages of naive, pre-scientific and false views of natural history. However, such claims are mistaken, since the questioning of radioisotope dating and the geologic timescale serves the very healthy purpose of uncovering assumptions and bias. The reappraisal of Earth's history also opens up entirely new fields of scientific research for upcoming scientists. In the last lecture, we will talk about intelligent design. Thank you.